The Folland Gnat was originally designed as a swept-wing subsonic light fighter aircraft, but was employed by the Royal Air Force as a two-seat advanced trainer. Join me in this video as I build the Airfix 1/72nd scale Folland Gnat T.1 in Yellowjack display team paint scheme. Hi, I'm Matt and you're watching Model Minutes. Before I start the video, as always, please remember that adult supervision may be required due to the use of sharp tools and toxic paints and chemicals. Airfix recommends this kit to those aged 8 years and older. I'll primarily be focusing on the build of this kit, but if you'd like to see what's included in the box, please take a look at the unboxing review video I made on this kit for more details. The first step was to give the plastic sprues a good wash in warm soapy water. This step helps to remove any oil, dirt or grease that could be left over from the moulding process and will help to give a good clean surface for paint and cement to stick to. It's recommended in the instructions that you complete this step, but ultimately it's your choice and I know that sometimes I don't bother. The plastic parts were then left to air dry. Throughout this build I will either use some cutters to snip the plastic components from the sprue, or cut them away using a sharp knife. Any rough plastic can then be sanded smooth using a nail file. The first parts that I removed from the sprue are the cockpit components. These consist of chairs, control panels and other small details. Some of these can be quite small and fiddly, so tweezers would be a useful tool to help place them correctly. The various parts are all cemented together, and I'll primarily be using Tamiya extra thin cement during this build as it has good flow qualities and it bonds quickly. It's also easy to place accurately due to the included applicator brush in the lid of the pot. With the cockpit now assembled, it was given a coat of Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic, which I thinned with Tamiya X20A acrylic thinners. Thinning your paint will help to avoid leaving any brush marks, but it may mean that you need a few more layers to get a good uniform finish. Humbrol 64 light grey matte acrylic was then used straight out of the pot to paint the rear bulkhead of the cockpit. I used a fine brush to avoid placing it in any incorrect areas. There are a couple of decals which need to be added to the control panels. They were cut away from the backing paper and then soaked in warm water. This will help release the transfers from the backing paper. Whilst the decals were soaking, Humbrol Decal Fix solution was brushed onto the control panels. This solution will help soften the decals and help them stick to the plastic parts. The transfers are now carefully slid into position and pressed down. Any manipulation can be carefully done at this stage before they start to set due to the decal fix. Take care not to move them around too much, as you will run the risk of damaging them. When they were in position and had set slightly, a further layer of decal fix was brushed over the top to help soften them further. You can see here that I've already painted the crew figures and wheels with Humbrol 33 matte black acrylic. I'm going to paint the crew as indicated by the instructions, which means that they need a coat of Humbrol 64 light grey acrylic. I went back over the helmet visors and oxygen hoses on the figures with Humbrol 33 matte black, then carefully picked out the bare skin on their faces with Humbrol 61 matte flesh acrylic. You'll be able to notice that here I've also painted their boots in matte black, and I've used Humbrol 34 white acrylic to paint their gloves. Humbrol 24 Trainee Yellow acrylic was used to highlight their life vests. I did this very carefully using a fine paintbrush for accurate application. Citadel non-oil acrylic black wash was then brushed over both crew figures. This wash collects in the recessed details and introduces shade, creating a contrast between the raised and recessed details whilst also dulling down any bright colours. The Humbrol 11 silver acrylic paint, which comes as part of the aircraft set, was then thinned and brushed onto the various areas that required it. These were the landing gear bays, doors and the exhaust areas. I find this particular paint to be quite difficult to use, as it has a tendency to clump and form blotches, whilst not covering the entire surface that you are painting. Although I managed to use this paint and covered the areas that needed it, I would recommend getting a better version of metallic silver if you can. Perhaps the enamel or metal coat paints Humber will do, or even something from another manufacturer. If I'd had any silver spray paints at the time, I probably would have used those. Now it's time to add the pilots to the cockpit. They were cut from the sprue and cemented into place. The helmets are then painted with Humber 69 Gloss Yellow. This again is not a great paint, so if you can find a better alternative, I would recommend that you do so. The landing gear legs can now be cemented into one half of the landing gear bay. You'll notice that I haven't painted these yet. I'll do that after they are cemented together. I used Humber 64 light grey to do this, but will go and pick out the silver areas later when the paint is dry. The fuselage halves are now removed from the sprue and cleaned up. I need to add the previously painted air intake components inside these parts, so I cemented them into place. Humber 33 matte black acrylic was now used to paint the internal walls of the cockpit. The landing gear doors are next to be added. They cement onto their respective landing gear legs, which I assembled a couple of steps ago. The cockpit I constructed earlier is now glued into one half of the fuselage, which is then followed by the landing gear assemblies, which are cemented into the correct positions inside their respective fuselage halves. Here I'm stuffing the nose with as much sticky tack as I can to help add more weight towards the front. If you don't add weight to the nose, the model will fall backwards and sit on its tail when on display. With that done, the fuselage halves can be joined together. You can run the extra thin cement down the seams in the plastic whilst you hold them together. Pressure will need to be applied until the cement cures, so clothes pegs or masking tape could be used to hold them together. This base plate component can now be cemented into place. It's worth noting that you can build this kit with the landing gear raised or lowered, and as a result this part will be different depending on which version you choose. The landing gear leg on the nose can now be added. I found this to be quite a fiddly step, trying to align all the various details with their respective holes. Care must be taken here too, as these parts are quite delicate and you run the risk of damaging them. The wings are now cut from the sprue and cleaned up. The lower portions of the wings have inserts which need to be glued into place. With that done, the wings can now be cemented onto the fuselage. They press into place and fit quite well. Make sure you check the alignment and that they are level as the glue cures. The tail surfaces can now be cemented on, and again just check they are level and not drooping as they dry. This is then followed by the air intake parts, which you need to get the right way round because otherwise they won't fit properly. I did find I had to trim a little plastic off of these parts to get them to sit correctly on the model. The probe on the nose of the aircraft can now be glued into its slot. This part can be easily bent or knocked off, so be careful as you handle the model from now on. I used Humber 24 Trainer Yellow Matte Acrylic as a base layer. I have found that this yellow paint has fairly good coverage, and it was thinned to prevent leaving brush strokes. A medium flat brush was used to get quick and even layers. Next, the included Humber 69 Gloss Yellow was thinned and applied over the top. I found this to be a particularly difficult paint to use. It tended to pool in places, and I can imagine that if it hadn't been thinned, it would have been sticky and difficult to apply. A better option might be to use a spray can of yellow gloss, or something better from another manufacturer. Humber Matte Black No. 33 was painted onto the vertical tail surface as per the painting instructions. I did this carefully using a fine brush, but you could also use masking tape to help get a crisp line where the yellow and black meet. I also used this colour to carefully paint the internal area of the rear exhaust. Humbrol 135 satin acrylic varnish was then thinned with a little water and brushed over the entire model. This will form as the base layer for the decals and help prevent them from silvering. I used this to help blend the various matte and gloss areas together and give one uniform finish. The hubs of the wheels were carefully painted with Humbrol 11 silver whilst they were still on the sprue. I used a fine paintbrush to try and accurately place the paint. Next, the entire decal sheet was then soaked in warm water. You could cut the sheet into more manageable parts, but I wanted to do all the decals in one go. As with the previous application of decals in the cockpit, I will first brush decal fix in the correct areas, carefully place the decal, and then apply more decal fix solution over the top. The decals are to the normal standard from Airfix and apply well to the model. Whilst you watch the completion of this step, I'll tell you a little about the real Folland Gnat T.1. Originally designed as a light fighter aircraft, the Gnat saw service in the Royal Air Force as an advanced jet trainer, but it did see combat use with other air forces around the world. The RAF took delivery of its first Gnats in 1962 to the Central Flying School at RAF Little Rissington, with more being delivered later that year to RAF Valley as part of No. 4 Flying Training School. The Yellowjack display team was informally formed by a group of instructors at RAF Valley in 1963 and painted their Gnats in this distinctive paint scheme. They became a formal part of the RAF in 1964, but it was short-lived, however, as the RAF decided to formally reform the display team at RAF Little Rissington under the Central Flying School only a year later. The aircraft were repainted red and renamed the team as the Red Arrows. The yellow paint scheme and Yellowjack name was believed to not be particularly in keeping with the identity of the RAF. The RAF eventually replaced the Gnat with the Hawk, with the last Gnat being retired in 1978. Many found their way into technical ground training establishments, and some can still be found flying today in the hands of private owners. The kit in this set depicts a Folland Gnat T.1 of the Yellowjack display team based at RAF Valley in 1964. With the decals now in place and having cured, a layer of Humbrol 135 satin varnish, but this time the enamel version, was applied to the entire model. This paint has been thinned with white spirit and it will help protect the decals and previous acrylic layers. Whilst the varnish is drying, I applied the final coat of Humbrol 69 Gloss Yellow to the canopy frames. I did this carefully using a fine brush. If I get any in the wrong place though, the acrylic paint can be carefully scraped away with a cocktail stick or pointed tool. Citadel non-oil acrylic wash is now applied to the various panel lines and recessed details of the model. This wash will seep into these details and help highlight them, whilst also providing some subtle weathering. When this wash has dried, the excess can be removed using a cotton bud dipped in acrylic thinners. I tend to do this in the direction of airflow to help give even more realistic staining. Had I not used a previous enamel layer to protect the paint, all the acrylic layers would be removed in this step, which is something I wanted to avoid. The wheels are removed from their sprue and then carefully cemented into place on the landing gear legs. Any missing areas of black paint on the tyres can then be touched up. Humbrol 11 silver was then used to carefully paint the probe on the nose of the aircraft. The cockpit canopy was then glued into place using a general purpose glue. I used this as it doesn't cause the plastic to fog up, which polycement can cause. It does leave little strings of glue though, so I have to watch out for that as I use it. The final step was to add the clear landing light on the nose of the aircraft using the same general purpose glue. And that's it. That's as far as I went with the construction of the Airfix Folland Gnat T.1 in Yellowjack paint scheme. So, What do I think of this kit? Well, Airfix builds it as a skill level 1, which means that it should be easy to build. Generally, it wasn't too hard, but I did find it a little fiddly in places, particularly whilst getting all the landing gear bits and pieces in the right place. I don't think a beginner would struggle much with this one though, but the area that they might find a little difficult is using the included gloss yellow and 11 silver paints. I mean, that stuff is pretty bad. Yes, it's probably better than not having any paint at all, but still, if you use that paint straight out of the pot, you're probably going to end up with some thick and gloopy paint on the model and be a bit disappointed with the finished results. My suggestion here would be to do something similar to what I've done, where you base coat it with another yellow and then thinly apply the included paint, or, which is perhaps better, go and get a cheap yellow and silver spray paint and use them instead. The paint scheme isn't too hard to do. It is basically one colour with a few little variations here and there, and I didn't really use that many extra paints or products during the build of this one. Generally though, this is a really nice little kit to build. This particular tooling of the Airfix Gnat dates from 2012, so it's not one of the oldest kits in the range, being one of the more recently designed and updated models. It replaces the previous 1964 tooling of the kit, which was retired with the introduction of this updated version. This kit was retailing for £5 in a well-known discount supermarket here in the UK during both 2018 and 2019 Christmas periods, and for that price it is totally worth the buy, especially seeing as it comes with 4 paints, a tube of cement and a brush as well. Obviously, a little bit let down with the included paints, but it's not such a big issue. This kit has been available in a number of different paint schemes too, with this Yellowjack version being part of a gift set, starter set and even a display set with 2 aircraft at various times since the tooling was made. Other versions include the Red Arrows and Training paint schemes, of which I've actually got a few in my stash somewhere. Not all versions may currently be available, but there is usually one or another kind of this kit in the current Airfix catalogue. So, in conclusion, this is a well-detailed and well-designed little kit which builds really nicely, but this particular version is let down by the included gloss yellow and metallic silver paints. Despite this, I would recommend this iconic little aircraft model kit in its short-lived paint scheme. Before I finish the video, honourable mention to my patrons over on Patreon, thanks for your support. To find out more about becoming a patron and the perks it gets you, take a look at the links in the description. There are also other ways to see more of my work. You can join my Discord server and chat in real time to other members of the community, or follow me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. All that's left to say is thanks for watching, and I'll see you all on the workbench again next time.